Welcome to the Aquest Podcast, conversations about regs, funds, and governance with your host, Daniel Lawler.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to the Aquest Podcast. My name is Daniel Lawler from Aquest, and I'm your host for the podcast episode. If you're new to the Aquest Podcast, do hit subscribe on whatever your preferred podcast provider is to be kept up to date as and when we drop new podcasts. So we've been beating the ESG drum for a little while, the environmental, societal, and governance factors that go into how investment managers make their decisions. And for this episode, I'm joined by Bill Prew and Victoria Gillespie of Indos. Indos does a number of things, including acting as a depository, but they also have a part of the business that helps asset management firms with their own ESG compliance, understanding how it is that they incorporate that into their investment processes, documenting, and making sure that that is a living part of what they do. So for the episode, I was very interested to chat about in the immediate future, the new requirements coming into effect in March of 2021, gosh, not too far away now, on disclosures for sustainable finance, and what impact that's having on firms and how they're going about applying, but also a little bit further down the tracks, looking at how firms can demonstrate that the investments they've made are actually as green as they say. So some interesting challenges around that. But to begin with, we chat about asset management firms themselves and the need for the firms to take into account their own impact environment and what have you when it comes to the way that they run their business, because you can't really ignore that and then expect to tell a convincing story about ESG in terms of the portfolios that you run. So that's the beginning point. Key message though from the podcast is get started now on your ESG compliance for the sustainable finance disclosure regulations, because March 2021 will roll around very quickly. So I know the to-do lists are long. Here's another item for them. So pre-book quickly. If you want to do it and do it in a way that'll make any kind of important difference, really the time to begin is now. Okay, on with the podcast. Hello, Bill and Victoria, and welcome to the Aquest Podcast. I'm delighted to have you guys here to educate and teach us all about ESG.
Hi, Danny. Pleased to be here.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Oh, it's great to have you guys. So I guess in lockdown, Bill, you would have been a frequent traveller from the UK over to Ireland, and in lockdown, all that must have stopped. So your carbon footprint must be a lot smaller.
Yeah, it is, and I think the whole industry's and the environment's benefiting from COVID. Quite well publicised, obviously, the sort of significant reduction in air travel, and air travel is a big contributor to a firm's sort of carbon footprint. I guess the thing that firms need to start thinking about now, though, is that, whatever the new normal is, then there's going to be other factors that are going to impact a firm's carbon footprint. So, for example, more heating at home through the winter months for all your staff and things like that. And due to some of the technicalities as to how you calculate your carbon footprint, the so-called Scope 3 emissions, which is use of electricity and heating, etc., at home, are outside the scope of the normal calculations. So firms are going to have to adapt if they're certainly going through sort of carbon neutral processes and calculations. Will have to sort of adapt for that new normal.
Yeah, absolutely. It always changes. And I guess when you talk about firms there, Bill, I think this is important for the cynics who might view ESG as greenwashing or as an opportunity to tell a story, but there's not really much to it beyond that. It is important that not only the firms that are the firms invested in, but the asset management firms are also living this and applying ESG and sustainability to what it is that they do and how they run their business and looking at things like carbon.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. But we always are at pains to stress that ESG in the asset management industry is not just about, the portfolio and the sort of considering ESG factors within the investment process, but what managers can and should be doing is looking closer to home at what their own ESG policies are. And it's something that, I guess some types of portfolios don't necessarily lend themselves well to sort of trying to take into account ESG characteristics, but certainly all managers can do their bit in terms of looking at their carbon footprint, trying to become carbon neutral, looking at corporate social responsibility, and all those sorts of factors. So, and I think increasingly investors are looking for managers to demonstrate that they are taking it seriously as an organization. And the other factor, of course, is that, and this is where we've benefited as a firm by focusing a lot on ESG and sort of corporate social responsibility internally, the employees expect it nowadays. So employees, other stakeholders. So, increasingly, I think firms that don't address this properly at a management company level are going to find it hard to retain and recruit the best staff.
And Victoria, do you find that firms are receptive to this? Like, I guess it's a very obvious inconsistency if they're saying one thing about how they invest, but they're doing something completely the opposite, how they run their own business. So they're kind of surprised that you're looking at them when you start to talk to them about ESG. They say, well, what are you doing? Do they kind of think it's all for the portfolio?
Actually, we've had a mixture, and that's quite pleasing in a way, because I think the perception is exactly the way that you've just explained it. But actually, we're finding a lot of managers are quite open because they're embracing the process, and to be able to explain it, they need to pursue their own policies and work out how that impacts themselves. So part of that training process is really understanding the impact, understanding what the investors want, and really doing, as Bill said, doing what they, practicing what they're preaching in terms of the funds. So for us, it's quite a pleasing trend. And, we've worked with a couple of managers and being able to take them through that process.
And I guess
which is good. It's a relatively straightforward process. It's relatively easy to do. And it will become there's loads of pluses as a result of doing this. And it's a relatively easy process to follow.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's nothing like market forces to change behavior. So one thing having rules, and kind of, I guess if you're at the receiving end of them, it could be kind of grudging that you comply. But if you find that investors stay away from you because of your approach to how you do ESG and sustainability in your own business, or people won't come and work for you because of it, you might find they're much more inclined to buy in and change and embrace change.
Exactly. The point here is that it's not new, albeit in the investment management world, it seems to be, relatively, recent trajectory in terms of people embracing these changes and undertaking this process. But, for our clients, and we're seeing that if you don't do this, you're more an outlier. So, I suppose you flip it and say, well, why would you not do this?
Yeah. And I guess as an industry, asset management, Bill, probably we look at ourselves and we're in offices and we're not out digging coal mines or polluting the environment that way. Or, it's not heavy industry. It's not petrochemicals. We're not making arms. So you kind of view ourselves, we're pretty good. Our impact on the environment and what have you is negligible. So this doesn't really apply to us. But I guess that's not the case now. They're much more conscious that they need to act the same as everybody else.
I think that's right. But of course, clearly the asset management industry has got a big role to play in influencing positive change within, the companies that they invest in. And I think that's the crux of this, isn't it? That whilst they might not have a direct, material carbon footprint, for example, as an asset management business, they can certainly influence, depending on their strategies. Some probably lend more than others, perhaps, but they can certainly influence positive behavior of the underlying companies.
Absolutely. You look at the trillions of assets under management and the influence that can have on firms that are being invested in. So obviously we know March next year is day one for disclosures regulation. I was thinking about it before. That's not too far away. Like, when you take Christmas out of that, and you're really only talking about 5 months of effort between now and then. And there is quite a bit for firms in the asset management industry to do. How are you finding firms reacting, Bill? Are they all over this? Is it a lastminute.com job?
Look, I think, these sustainable finance disclosure regulations, or SFDR as people are calling them, is just one part of what I think must be the whole sort of sustainability agenda and the regulations coming out of Europe. And this is just one part of, I think, 4 different pieces of regulatory change coming out of Europe around sustainability. So there's going to be changes to AFMD, UCITS, MiFID 2. There's a framework regulation talking about taxonomy of environmental, what amounts to environmental sustainable sort of factors, etc. The first one that is going to hit is SFDR. I think there's so much information and news and noise around ESG. It's hard to see the wood for the trees sometimes. I honestly don't think that many managers have really started to look into this and embrace it. And I guess you've got Brexit in between as well, which is going to occupy some minds as well in the industry. So at the end of the day, though, depending on which part of the industry you're looking at, SFDR, unless you're a sort of 500 person plus business, or if you are specifically sort of running ESG sort of labeled or specific investment products, SFDR for most firms, certainly in the alternatives industry, should be a case of just defining your policy and disclosing it on your website about how you take into account sustainability factors in your investment process. So we see it as frankly, a good opportunity for firms that haven't already done this to at least start to articulate what their policy is. Because whether it's regulations or investors or employees, you can't ignore it. And what are you going to do? Put a statement on your website to say that you don't consider any of these factors at all? I think that's going to, make you stand out like a sore thumb versus your competitors. So I think firms have to embrace it. But we're not seeing a lot of firms embracing it just yet. I think it's
fair. Yeah. Not unusual when new regulations come in that it's later rather than early that the firms end up getting to grips to it. And I guess if you are very active and you're very much promoting yourself as in the ESG business, you're all over this and you understand it. But I think it's the majority, the big report, where it's not something they're actively pursuing. It's not something that's actively at the top of their list. But as you said, nobody doesn't consider sustainability when they make an investment. But maybe it's just now that they start to articulate what it is that they look at and how important that piece is to them.
Yeah, I mean, we stress to managers when we talk to them that this is, as you say, maybe not sustainability, but they certainly will have considered governance factors, for example, as the G of ESG. Obviously, all the regulations focusing on the environmental and sustainability side, less so than social impact and governance. But the starting point for any manager is just to articulate what they do today. And when we've had conversations with managers, and you talk them through some of this stuff, and you say, well, this is what would be in a decent sort of manager and fund level ESG policy. They say, oh yeah, we consider that, we do that. Of course we look at that. So I think it's just articulating what you do, and also recognizing that, you don't have to start with a Rolls Royce. You just articulate what you do and set out what your journey is. What's been really interesting for Indos and our conversations is, as you probably know, Danny, our background years ago was really focusing on providing depository services to alternative funds. And I can't think of a time when we had a CIO of one of our clients actually show much interest in what we do as a depository. It was very much a sort of an operations compliance type role. You start talking about ESG, and then you get the CIOs joining the calls because they're really interested to learn. You've got people that this is a whole new sort of game for many people in the industry, certainly those that have been in the industry managing funds for a long time. It's a big learning curve, and they recognize that. I think it's pretty obvious how people recognize that environmental factors, for example, or frankly social others, can have a material impact on valuation of securities, and therefore they need to be considering this in their investment process. I mean, it just so happens now that you've got, as I say, changes coming through to AFMD, UCITS, etc., where firms are going to, under those regulations, have to demonstrate how they're taking into account sustainability factors in the investment process. But I guess my point is that the CIOs are embracing it because they recognise the importance of it.
And as you said, I guess when they start to think about it, they realise that there's an amount of this that they already do around governance, say. And are they receptive then to saying, well, actually, do you know what? We're pretty good in G. We kind of understand that environmental is important, but actually now let's be a little bit more specific about how we do our due diligence on it and take it into account in our valuation. So it gets it out there in the conversation, and then they embrace it and take it on. Is that kind of how it works, Victoria?
Yeah, absolutely. And we realise as well, there's not just, the attraction there, but also there's, the finances that back this up. So in terms of sustainable funds over the last sort of year, Morningstar reported that actually they were up compared to their industry peers in more traditional based funds. So, you've got the incentive, the financial incentive as well. So it's not just the regulatory side, it's also the financial impact too.
And so once you've kind of taken a firm through that process and they've judged, actually they're doing some of this already, and now they want to articulate that, they start from where they are, and they are, but they're mindful of incorporating more into what they do for a variety of reasons. When they start to look at their investments then, and they're trying to ensure that what they're investing in is actually sustainable, has a certain impact on the environment that they expect. How do they go about verifying that? Because this seems to be where the real crux of the matter is.
Yeah, I mean it's challenging. I mean, I think you said there's a lot of different regulation, etc. There's a lot of different data sources, a lack of consistency between the data. There's a whole sort of part of the accounting standards industry and sort of bodies that are trying to put a framework or a taxonomy around ESG factors, because ultimately you need the companies that you're investing in to be publishing in the report and accounts, etc. Properly audited information, which enables analysts to sort of interpret that. In the meantime, if I guess firms can try to leverage some of the ESG sort of specific data providers that have, there's a whole industry that's been developing more rapidly over the last few years around ESG data provision. But I think that's one of the challenges here is that, people often say if you compare, Tesla in terms of environmental ratings across the different data providers, you get some quite different results. So, how do managers sort of sift through all of this and sort of factor into their investment process is actually quite challenging for them.
And I guess the point with data isn't so much that it's bad today or it's, the quality isn't where you'd want it to be today. I guess they're starting from a pretty low base. But the important thing is that it gets better, and you can see a continual pattern of the data getting better. So it's not that it has to be perfect today, but in 5 years' time, we should be looking back and seeing that the data today compared to the data in 5 years' time is infinitely better in 5 years' time. And that's really where we want to get to, surely.
Yeah, and it will be, no doubt. I mean, it's a rapidly evolving space, this, in terms of sort of trying to set accounting standards and for disclosures and consistency and having those audited and things like that. So undoubtedly it will improve over time. I think that, asset managers have to, use various different data inputs, treat them with a degree of skepticism, but they certainly, they are necessary inputs into the process now.
And so then in your role, I guess as a depository firm, do you have to then oversee what the investment manager, the Manco, is doing to verify and certify that they're as green as they say they are? And how do you go about doing that bit?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's interesting because, obviously, I mean, this would apply to any depository or Manco, frankly, that was acting for a fund that was an ESG labelled fund and no doubt would have some ESG investment restrictions. Then I think the obligations of the Manco and the depository are to ensure that that fund is being managed in accordance with those objectives. And that, therein lies the reason why Indos started to sort of pivot its attention towards ESG getting on for 2 years ago now, because we could see that there was this rapid growth and investor interest, etc., particularly within the alternative space, but obviously more traditional funds as well around ESG. And we said, well, look, a big part of what we do is to independently sort of review portfolios and making sure they're complying with, what they say on the tin in the prospectus. So if we could just build some relationships with some ESG data providers, then we ought to be able to screen portfolios for ESG compliance. And if we had a fund with an ESG investment restriction, we would have to do that today. So we set off on this journey thinking that, well, there must be an opportunity in the market here to produce independent sort of transparency reports on portfolios, to sort of shine a lens on the portfolios in terms of their ESG sort of characteristics. And I think longer term, there is a market there and there will be a demand there. But what we found is managers aren't ready for that. And investors aren't pushing managers for that. But where managers do need to progress and focus their attention is, as we've been saying, putting in place the basics around the policies and showing how they're incorporating these factors into their investment process. We ultimately think that transparency, will follow. So that's kind of something that we continue to develop, but the market's just not there for it at the moment.
Okay, well, I guess it's often the case with newer developments that it takes a little while for everything to play out. But as we get towards, say, look a little bit nearer in the time to March of next year, are there kind of 3 key things that fund providers need to do between now and then, and what are the big pain points that they've just got to make sure they're planned for and that they kind of sidestep and get through this as easily as they can?
Well, I mean, I think the sooner they start working on their policies, the better. There is an awful lot of information out there in the market, so this is not an uncharted territory. I think you can, there's various industry bodies, etc., that have been doing a lot of work. I mean, you don't have to be, obviously, I won't be flavor of the month for saying this for UNPRI, but there's a misconception that you have to join bodies such as UNPRI, which I don't think in the early stages of your ESG journey necessarily need to do. But they are another example of a lot of information out there to provide guidance and information and examples and so on. So I think the sooner firms start that process, the better, because as you said right at the beginning, it's not that far away, March. And that's really the main thing they need to do. I suppose the other part of it is if investors, I mean, I can't imagine that investors are not talking to their underlying managers about this, but you really need to understand what your investor sort of appetite and sort of needs and wishes are around ESG, because clearly, whether you've got the sort of product governance changes coming through regulation where you have to consider your investors' sort of requirements in this area. I mean, it's obviously that's who managers exist to serve, isn't it? So you have to understand what your investor requirements are and then factor those into your processes and policies as well.
And so kind of wrapping all this up, Victoria, do you think this will work? So that the ESG that looked at the disclosure regulation, but the regime as a whole and the agenda being pushed by Europe, it's intended as a force for good to improve all aspects of ESG and sustainability. Do you think it'll work? Do you think we look back on this in 10 years' time and see a shift, or not? Is this, March is going to roll around, 99% of providers are going to call their lawyers for a template, stick their name, pop it in, and that's as much as ESG is going to do.
No, I don't think
it's a terribly cynical view.
That sounds it. I don't think it's a one-off. I mean, as we said, previously, this hasn't just got here. It's been around for a long time, albeit there's a slow evolution. But I think with the natural or with the more recent regimes that have come into play, I think that people are taking more of an interest. And as I said previously, they're looking at the financial upside of incorporating and embracing this as well. So it's not just a case of it's another thing we're here to do. It's going to be led by the investors. The investors are going to expect it. The future investors over the coming years are going to expect it. So why would you not do it as a manager? So I think, to answer your question, I think it's here to stay. And I think the biggest thing for us is even the upside of what's been caused within the industry, and certainly the upshift in the sustainable funds and the inflows that have increased as a result of COVID-19. I think that proves to us that this is here to stay because it's at the forefront of investor minds. And if it's driven by them, the managers are going to need to address it. So we think the financial services market as a whole is going to be the driving force behind this to really force it over the line.
Money talks.
Absolutely.
Money talks. Last word to you, Bill. It seems to me that really the firms that will succeed here are the firms that believe. So if you're going through the motions and it's another compliance and you're going to have to put a policy in place because that's what the rules say, well, then that'll be as good as you are. But if you have a firm that actually believes in ESG and sustainability, believes it's good for investor outcomes, and it's something that investors want and they can deliver well and embrace this, then they're the firms that are going to succeed when it comes to ESG. I don't think you're going to blag your way through it.
No, I think that's inevitable. It's the same as a lot of things, isn't it? So yeah, I don't disagree with that at all, Danny.
So we wait and see. Thank you guys for your time. Very much appreciated. It's such a huge part of the agenda at the moment, ESG. It's really good to get some insights on what it means for firms and how they're going about tackling it in practice, and hopefully where all of this takes us in a few years' time, that it has proven to be a force for good and good returns for investors as well. Thanks, guys. Catch you next time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Danny.
You've been listening to the Aquest Podcast. For information about our training and advisory programs or our academy, visit aquest.ie. For more resources on regs, funds, and governance, check out our YouTube channel, Daniel Lawler, RURQ.